All right, why don't we get going? So welcome back, everyone, for another afternoon panel. In some of the initial discussions around the design of this conference, Orville Schell had a great idea, which was, we all tend to focus largely on the bilateral relationship between, obviously, the US and China. And that would be important to have a panel that looked at the perspectives, interests, thoughts of other Asian nations. It's often an accurate criticism of both countries, the US and China, that our actions take little into account the interests of other actors in the region. And for that reason, we're very excited to have both individuals from the region, also individuals from Washington, D.C. to join us electronically, virtually, as well as in person. And so I will just take a couple quick minutes to introduce and then turn it over to Fatema. So Fatema Sumar is the executive director of the Harvard Center for International Development and will be our moderator. In terms of speakers, we have Ian Chong, associate professor at NUS, National University of Singapore. We have Bopa Porn, a Nieman Fellow and an independent journalist based in Phnom Penh. And finally, we have Ed Case, the co-founder of the Congressional Pacific Islands Caucus. And the point today is to think about how Asian countries see China and the US-China competition. What are their interests and how are they reacting to various dynamics and also mechanisms like trade sanctions, for example. So on the economic, social, and political front. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Fatema. Thank you.
Well, Ember, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. And to those like Ian, where it's 3 a.m. in Singapore, good morning, and thank you for staying up to be with us. It's great to see all of you, and I just want to really thank the Fairbank Center and the Rajawali Foundation Institute for just this terrific conference today. For those of you that are just joining, we've had really rich discussions all day long, really looking at Chinese views on US-China relations, China's realities at home, cooperation and competition. And now today's panel is really looking, as Edward said, as how Asian countries view the US-China dynamic. And I'm really honored to join this panel. I'm over at the Harvard Center for International Development, but much of my career has been in Asia. I think I've been to almost every country in Asia in the course of representing the US government, both from a foreign policy and development finance landscape. And a lot of the issues that we're facing today are ones that are critical choices along the front lines. And so most recently, when I was in the Biden administration, I spent a lot of my time in countries like Nepal, which were really caught in many ways between US and China infrastructure politics, as in the case study of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which I was representing. So as Asian countries are against the backdrop right now of the pandemic, inflation, and uneven recovery, the transition to net zero, and looking at over $1 trillion financing and investment infrastructure gap, and that was before the pandemic, they're facing a lot of choices. And so I'm really delighted to have such a distinguished panel here with us today to really share with us the perspectives, both from countries like Singapore, Cambodia, other parts of Asia, and also Washington, D.C. How should we think about other views around the table? And the questions I want to put out there, big picture for the panelists to address, are looking at how do Asian countries really balance the fear of falling into whether it's debt traps or the positive aspects of Chinese investment with what the US can offer China and where the US can also think through issues like trade sanctions on China, and what hope is there for what the US can offer these countries. So with that introduction and backdrop, I'm really delighted to first introduce and open the floor to Ian Chong, Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. And Ian, I really wanted to ask you to frame the question around Singapore in particular has always played a balancing act between the US and China. Is that becoming more difficult? Is Singapore stuck in the middle? Is the US or China trying to force countries like Singapore to choose sides through following particular technology or telecom standards, for example? Thank you again for being up and for joining us, Ian. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you all for having me here. So this question about Singapore and trying to find some middle way has always sort of been out there. I think it's predicated on this view that from Singapore too, right? That it's really a beneficiary of globalization, right? That it's part of this value chain that links the U.S. With China via various countries, including Southeast Asia. And so that's been the sort of operating assumption for a really long time. As the US and China grow further apart, both because the US itself is perhaps not as internationalist as it used to be, but also as China is looking more towards internal circulation, that old model of trying to be part of the whole value chain, I think needs to be rethought a little bit. There hasn't been enough consideration of where things might go, what things might look like, what the sort of alternatives might be. So the default position has been this: we don't want to choose sides. But that's, if you think about the term, we do not want to choose. It's a very passive policy, right? In terms of having more positive options in order to buffer themselves, Singapore, and I think many of its neighbors, we haven't really come up with a solution yet. Part of it is because the main regional organization, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is at this point sort of very riven by internal differences, that they don't have a good system going on. So there are lots of limitations to what we can do. I think also I want to add a little bit, which is this sort of view that the US or China wanting to make Singapore and others choose sides. I think that's I think it's true that neither the U.S. nor China want to make Southeast Asian countries choose sides, but the point is not what they're. I mean, it's what they're doing, right? What they're not really actually thinking about Southeast Asia or other regional countries. I think at the forefront. So they don't intentionally want to get these countries to choose sides, but what they're doing, right, is creating a situation where there's more distance, where trying to work with both simultaneously and gain and accrue the same benefits as before is increasingly difficult. So that's in effect what's going on, right? So in short, short of not having some sort of alternative, I think that the region, and Singapore included, I think is a bit stuck at this point in time. There's a lot of fear of punishment from the PRC, and there's a lot less confidence in U.S. commitment and engagement with the region than before. I'll stop there for now.
Ian, thank you. And I want to come back to this idea of fear of punishment and what consequences that has, not just for Singapore, but for other countries in Asia. But let me turn for a moment to Representative Case. Representative, thank you so much for being with us here today. You're one of the co-founders of the Congressional Pacific Island Caucus, and you've really played a leading role in Congress on centering our foreign policy around the Indo-Pacific region. Can you share with us today some of your priorities for the Indo-Pacific region from Washington and strategies that you think are really important for the U.S. to consider vis-a-vis the rest of Asia?
Well, thank you so much again, first of all, for having me, and to all of the sponsors, particularly the Asia Society, who I work with closely. As you can tell, or may not be able to tell, I'm not in my office in DC and I'm not home. So I'm in transit in an airport as usual. And so it may get a little noisy and I may have to leave precipitously. So apologies for that up front. I think, first of all, I would recharacterize your question from Asia, the use of the word Asia, to the Indo-Pacific, to encompass a much broader perspective than what many people might think of when they think of the word Asia. So we're really thinking about the Pacific Islands. We are thinking about the Pacific Rim. We are thinking about Asia proper and broader Asia, so South Asia to be included. And so that's the context for my comments. I would also give you kind of a broad comment, and that is that I think at this point I'm just a ruthless realist on China. I suppose I would call myself. I had hoped, along with many throughout the world, that the last 20 years would have a different result, that we would not be in the position we are today, but that just simply hasn't happened. I think that if you want to frame perhaps the big picture choice and challenge, it is, does one think that the international rules-based order that has basically with major exceptions, of course, but basically ensured peace and increasing prosperity for much, if not all of the world over the last 3 generations. Should that continue or should it be supplanted? I think that's one of the large questions that each country has. I think also that if the basic question, first of all, I feel presumptuous answering the question of how do Asian countries feel or Indo-Pacific countries feel about the choice that they're facing, because obviously I'm not part of those countries. So I would characterize my remarks as how does one member of the US Congress think they are feeling about this rather than answering for them? You've got great panelists who can answer for themselves. I think the basic answer to your question is the balance is not being handled very well because, I think Ian characterized it very, very well. It's a very difficult choice. It's very uncertain. It has pros and cons. Everybody wishes everybody would get along, that we weren't in this larger geopolitical challenge for whether the international rules-based order will continue or whether there'll be an attempt to supplant it or to create an alternative international rules-based order, which would force its own set of choices. And so it is a very uncertain time. We have certainly seen examples of countries that have been forced to the choice. Australia being the leading example, being forced to the choice by positions that China disagreed with, and China tried to extract consequences for that through trade cutoffs, which Australia, by the way, has survived very, very well. And in fact, it did not lead to the intended result for China. We've certainly seen that in the country of Palau, a critical country and friend and freely associated with the United States, where China cut off tourism to that country, and Palau is finding another direction. And so, other countries like Singapore have really, I think, done the best in the region of trying to, balance over time. But I personally think that balance is going to get increasingly difficult, at least on the current road we are. I think for the United, I take Ian's criticism or question about whether the U.S. Is sufficiently engaged, and your introductory comments of whether the U.S. has perhaps disengaged from the world. And I think if I was the rest of the world, I would think the same thing too, looking inward. I don't feel that we are disengaging. Personally, as one member of Congress, I feel that, I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee. We have substantially increased our appropriations to the Indo-Pacific. We have created caucuses such as the Pacific Islands Caucus. We obviously have had a lot more legislators go to the Indo-Pacific, as evidenced by Speaker Pelosi's a visit to Taiwan. And so I think the real course here is, and I think that isolationism in the United States is a minority position that gets a lot of attention. But I think that the results of our recent election show that the American people really want a pragmatic approach, both domestically and in foreign policy. And I think that leads to a continuation and an increase in engagement around the world, including the Indo-Pacific. So I think the basic answer to your question is engagement increase across all fronts, and re-engagement where we already have been engaged. That's been our challenge in the Pacific Islands, where for a variety of reasons, we lapsed in terms of continued engagement over the last 2 decades. China saw a vacuum there and is trying to move in. And so, from my perspective, if we're dealing with a ruthlessly practical China focused on its own goals, which is an extension of a sphere of influence throughout the Indo-Pacific and beyond, and that can coexist under a common set of principles and values. But if it doesn't coexist there, then you have no alternative but to eventually be put to a much harder choice. And that depends on all of us helping each other.
Congressman, thank you. I really appreciate the reframe as we think about the Indo-Pacific. And I'd love to come back and dig a little bit more into how the U.S., and as you see it from a member of Congress, what the incentives are on the table, particularly for the Pacific Islands and other parts of the Indo-Pacific, and we'll come back to that. Let me turn now to Bopha Forn, who's now a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard University. And Bopha, you've done a lot of amazing journalism and writing on the perspective on the ground from Cambodia and the choices Cambodia is facing vis-a-vis China, particularly as it thinks about its own economic choices. Can you share a little bit about Cambodia's changing relationship with China and some of the fault lines that you're seeing playing out today?
Hi, everyone. I'm here. I'm not an expert, but I try to share my perspective as a journalist in Cambodia. So as you may know that it's been a long while that Cambodia kind of like trapped between the China and the US, started decades ago when the US bombed Cambodia and then have General Lon Nol to take over the country. And then Cambodia fall into the trap of Khmer Rouge being supported by Chinese government. So the change is that the Hun Sen government, who was tapped by Vietnamese government to topple, to kick out Khmer Rouge, he got into the position from that on, and from then he was he's with the Vietnamese government, and he's in the 1980s even said in one of the essay reportedly he said that China is the root of all that evil in Cambodia. But as the thing changed in Cambodia in the 1993, after the UN organized elections in Cambodia, the Chinese increased its relationship with Cambodia as well. I think the major notice thing even was in 2006 when Premier Wan Jiabao visited Cambodia, and he promised Cambodia with $600 million in grant and loan. And from then, Chinese government have had Cambodia support with, without a doubt, supporting building road, infrastructures, bridges, and power, which provided more than 50% of the population's, power, electricity, which enable more than 50% of the people in Cambodia to use that power. And this infrastructure are very important for Cambodia to be able to kind of operate the garment industry, which contribute to about 9 billion to 10 billion every year. 99 to 10 billion dollars every year to the country economy. So that's the change. But then as the Chinese government have Cambodia in as the Chinese government have Cambodia more and more with funding the money, the US also become increasingly not so happy with Cambodia. So these are the things at the moment. Garment industry and footwear is the most important sector for Cambodia economy. So the reality is that the material, most of the factories are owned by Chinese companies, and Cambodian actually imported material from China, and then the US and the EU buy those products. So if something happening, or like the US decide to change anything in the system, it would hugely impact the Cambodia economy.
And I want to come back particularly, maybe we can talk about some examples from the garment industry when we come back to talk about some of this, because I think understanding even the entire value chain of how this is affected really teases out the tension point countries like Cambodia feel here. Could you talk a little more about the garment industry as an example of this, of the Chinese factories versus the US buyers?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how many people here know the fact that Cambodia and the US and the EU are the major market for Cambodia garment industry. That means they buying a lot of product from Cambodia that contribute to maybe 90 or 10 billion every year that Cambodia get from garment industry and footwear. And in this industry, ironically, most of the company or factories in Cambodia are owned by Chinese company and other foreign company not owned by Cambodian people. And the material that we imported from China. So if the US decided to change any, for example, it listed Cambodia as one of the member that can benefit from the general system of preferences. So if the US decide to change anything in that system, it would hugely impact the Cambodia economy.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And maybe Professor Chong, could you just frame for us a little bit of how you're seeing the rest of Asia and some of the choices that countries make? Because there's a lot of regional differentiation, as we know, whether you're talking about Central Asia or South Asia versus South Asia or the Pacific Islands. What sorts of pressure are you seeing play out in a regional way across the rest of Asia that you may want to share with this audience?
That's like half the world. That's huge. But okay, let me try. So I think one of the discussions that's out there is that there's a lot of dependence on China. I think to some degree that's right. That's right, especially in terms of trade in goods. So as Bopa has described, right, a lot of the connection with bits of Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia, I mean, the trade in goods is really high. China is a market for lots of components that they then assemble and sell elsewhere. But that's not the whole picture. The US, the EU, and Japan are by far larger investors. The Belt and Road notwithstanding, right? The sort of overall stock and also the inflow is much bigger from these places than the PRC. But I think they don't get that much attention because for one, there's a difference between realized investment and promised investment. The BRI has a lot of promised investment. Not all of that is realized. And the nature of that investment looks very, very different. So for the US, the EU, and Japan, that investment comes in through companies, right? It's a few million here, it's tens of millions there, it's 100 million somewhere else, it's in some cases a billion, those really big investments, and they accumulate, they add up. Whereas the way that the BRI works is that there's a big sort of flagship number. It's a big sticker number that's thrown on the headlines because it's very much state-led. So it looks huge, even though when you look at things cumulatively, it may not be the case. And also, if you look at trade and services, right, that tends to be much bigger with the developed economies, EU, Japan, the US. So what this all tells us is two things. One, much of Asia is on this sort of value chain, right? You have US, EU, Japanese investment coming in. They build factories, they provide services, and those factories will then produce goods that get sold to China or components that get sold to China. So it's part of this value chain that now, as the US and China are pulling apart in terms of the closeness of the trade, right, it's putting a lot of pressure on. So this gets me then to the different parts of Asia. Why I describe this broad overview is because everyone's structure of the economy is very different. Every economy is structured differently. So you have some economies that are far more trade dependent. They lean more towards the sort of export and goods type, what we've just heard from Wopa about Cambodia as an example, right, of a more sort of trade in goods dependent country. There are others that export commodities to China far more. Australia is a good example of this. That's why the sort of effort to punish Australia didn't work so much because China still needed a lot of ore. And in the case of Singapore, there's a playing up of this trade bit. However, if you look at ASEAN, for instance, we are each other's largest trading partner. Collectively, ASEAN is every ASEAN member's largest trading partner. But for Singapore, we do a lot more services. Services employ a lot more people. We, as a financial center, deal a lot more with investment. So in that sense, despite the talk about dependence on China, there's actually far less in Singapore. And just to give you why I talked about Cambodia and Singapore in this case is you find that because of where their interests lie, how much they need the China market, how much they need Chinese investment looks very different. And so that's one of the reasons why you have different countries across Asia pulling in different directions and why it's really hard, especially without a sort of coordinating mechanism for these countries to sort of get together and bargain collectively, right? So you have a lot of what looks like disarray, and each country individually, except with some exceptions, like say big ones like India and Indonesia, feel that they cannot withstand pressure from the PRC. On the US side, of course, the US tries to engage a lot, but I think the shadow of the Trump administration, I think, looms very, very large. There's a fear that a Trump-like figure or even Trump might come to office again with a Congress that looks very much like that at some point in the future. That those sorts of perceptions may not be true, but they will take some time to fix, probably more than one administration. So let me just hand off here. Thanks.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to actually tease out a point, Congressman, from Professor Chong's statement around infrastructure in particular, and really get your views of how, I mean, compared to the Belt Road Initiative, when you engage and when Congress, from the caucus perspective, engages, around what countries have, what the US has to offer specifically around infrastructure in particular, given the big development financing gaps, the infrastructure gaps. How do you view what the US has to offer here vis-a-vis the Chinese? And what are your thoughts more broadly on the US competitive space on infrastructure in Asia, in the ways that you view it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that the question has to be framed in this way: what do countries need? Because oftentimes the question is framed in terms of what do we want to provide, and that model doesn't work when you're talking about some countries that have very specific. And every country has general needs, but some countries have very specific needs. So, and I think the question is, those countries are in an impossible decision where, and I believe this to be the case, most countries in the Indo-Pacific would prefer to associate generally with the international rules-based order, to include the United States from a values and interest and prosperity and non-dependence proposition. But they have to take care of their needs. That's their number one obligation to their people. And they have to take care of those needs. And so, you know, the proper starting point is what does each country want and need, and who's trying to provide it under what conditions. That's really kind of where the rubber meets the road on all of this stuff. So let's take the Pacific Islands just as a subset, because I think it's a very discrete subset and it's instructive. The Pacific Islands need a couple of things. It's pretty straightforward. They are dealing with climate change. Climate change is an existential threat to these islands. They have to find a way to deal with climate change from an infrastructure perspective, from a resettlement away from the coastline perspective, if they can even do that. That's one challenge. They have very limited economic ranges. They don't do manufacturing. They don't do large scale services. Their industries are small scale. Their tourism. They are government to some extent, as a reference to Cambodia was, and they have to provide economically for their citizens. Their major resource, almost all of them, is their fisheries, and their exclusive economic zones are being, basically invaded by illegal, unauthorized and unreported fishing, to include China. And they need to enforce that maritime zone. And they need to have binding treaties on the high seas that will save the fish of the seas for their economies as well. So they have very, very distinct needs. And if we can't provide them, and if China is in there providing those, China's happy to try to provide those with I think, pretty good conditions on it. And I think we've seen examples of that in many of the Pacific Island countries. So I think we are very good in terms of capacity building. I think we're very good in terms of maritime security. I think we're very good in terms of kind of I guess I would call it quasi soft power. I think where China has been offering something that the U.S. Side, and I don't want to just limit this to the U.S. because we have a lot of partners out there that are very hardworking in the Pacific Islands, to include especially Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, and increasingly the Republic of Korea, and others, and obviously Britain and France and India now are all involved in the Pacific Islands. That's all welcome. They're all providing. But the area that I think is the biggest gap is infrastructure, and that is where China has practiced delivery of infrastructure on conditions that have been very severe. And we've seen that happen in other countries such as Sri Lanka. That's where we have to step it up a little bit more. And I think that we have been doing that. The recent initiative by the Biden administration to forge a new Pacific Island partnership with the leaders of all of the countries in Washington, D.C. and the White House was a good example of that. And that's going to lead to a substantially increased infrastructure investment. But other countries need to do it, such as Korea, for example, which is one of the kings of large scale infrastructure in our world. And they want to do it. And so that we have to encourage that. Otherwise, we are not going to be meeting the needs. And that forces these countries to an impossible choice.
Congressman, do you see, I really appreciate those examples. Do you see any political interest in Washington from Congress to increase development financing for infrastructure for the Pacific Islands, for instance.
Yeah.
Right now, there's very limited aid budgets, for instance, if it's USAID or Millennium Challenge Corporation or support through other USAID development finance institutions. Do you think that's something that would be of interest in deeper investments to actually offer grant financing or debt financing for infrastructure?
Well, it's not just of interest. We are actually doing that. We actually have been increasing the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Development Finance Corporation. We've been increasing our partnerships with other countries to increase. So the fact that we have a infrastructure assistance delivery gap is not lost on us. And so it's not a prospective goal. It's an actual initiative that needs to continue and it needs to increase because we're not at the level we need to be yet for the needs of the countries throughout the Indo-Pacific.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I think this is something where the numbers still, even as we deepen, the gaps are still, I think, evident here of where we could go and develop. But I'd like to open it up now to the audience for questions for the audience. So there is a microphone. If the audience at the airport wants to ask questions too, they are welcome. There's a microphone here in the hallway. Please do line up, introduce yourselves to our distinguished guests and end with a question. So who would like to go first? Please, thank you.
Ben, a retired businessman residing in Cambridge. I followed Australians' reluctance in choosing between prosperity and security for a number of years. It took people like realism scholar John Mishmeyer to persuade Australians to pick balance and choose side last year. Do you think most other countries in the region will follow suit sooner or later?
Thank you. Would any one of you like to take that question?
Yeah, I can take that question. So I don't think what Australia did is a matter of someone like John Mearsheimer or anyone else convincing them. I think what convinced them was China's punishment. That because they were trying to ask about the origins of COVID with the view that zoonotic diseases will be a big thing in the future. They had differences on the detention of Australian citizens in the PRC. So I think that's what did it. But I think the Australians' experience is also useful because what they show is that punishment from China, big as their economy might be, is limited. In essence, right? This sort of punishment is a unilateral sanction. And what we know is that sanctions generally are less efficient in getting the kinds of outcomes that you want. So you look at the sanctions on Russia, they bite, but they haven't stopped Russia, right? And that's multilateral. On unilateral sanctions, they are highly symbolic. They may create a shock. They may create costs for transition, but ultimately, they are pretty leaky. Countries can get around them. And that's exactly what Australia has shown. It's not just Australia. You look at South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Lithuania, the Czech Republic, Norway, Sweden, France. What they have in common is they've all been punished by China in some way or the other, and they've managed to recalibrate, right? And the sort of pressure has been somewhat eased. And I think that's a lesson that other economies need to learn and figure out how to do.
Yeah, I agree with everything just said. And I would make the observation that where there is disproportionate leverage in relationships, trade, defense, elsewise, that choice comes a lot faster. And so, for example, if countries in the Indo-Pacific have a broad alternative of trading partners, and ideally, if they could trade equally with a number of countries, including China, the United States, and everybody else, then it is less likely that punishment by cutting off trade would have an effect, and therefore it doesn't quite force the same range of choices. China's mistake with Australia was trying to punish Australia when Australia was willing to take the heat and had some remaining obviously trade that was 100% dependent upon China. And you see other countries in the region that are far more dependent on China in terms of trade, and it's a lot tougher for them. And so I think that, one of the goals here, again, we're not trying to get to a point where China is not a part of the world. We would love China to be a part of the broader world. A set of rules that are common to everybody, that are economic, democratic, environmental, human rights, a whole range of things that we've been trying to accomplish over the last 3 generations. That's the goal here. That can be achieved. I have some degree of hope for it. And I think there's some conditions under which it actually could happen, what we've been wanting to happen for 20 years, but it's not happening. But clearly, one of the goals here is to increase the alternatives for trade for many of these countries throughout the Indo-Pacific. So the Pacific Economic Partnership that the White House has announced and is initiating with Pacific Island countries. I felt it was a tragedy for our country some years ago to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. I hope we get back into some framework on that where, we're heading towards a hybrid, and I hope that happens. But that will help on this choice question.
Congressman, I know you're tight on time, so I just wanted to check in with you. Are you okay on time for another question?
Yeah, I'm actually good. I'm pretty close to the gate, so I'm just kind of watching it.
Okay. We really appreciate that you're with us so far. Let me turn to the next question here.
Okay, that's good. My next question is primarily for you, Representative Case. Although if anyone has any thoughts, I would love to hear it. My name is Connor Bralla. I'm a graduate student at the Fletcher School at Tufts. And I'm also have been resident in Shanghai for the past 8 years. So Representative Kevin McCarthy in July, in the lead up to Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, said that if he were elected speaker, he would also visit Taiwan. Now that it seems that he will almost certainly become Speaker of the House, I just wanted to ask Representative Case and everyone else if you think, to what extent you think this is a good or a bad idea, and why, and what the effects might be if he does visit.
Well, obviously, we've already seen that China feels it needs to make a point when senior U.S. Leadership visits Taiwan. And so we can expect that if probable Speaker McCarthy visits Taiwan, we'll see roughly the same reaction. But I think that the United States government is entitled to, on invitation, visit Taiwan. And I think when we give that up, when we concede that basic point, we take a already fraught relationship into a whole range of other challenges. I think that incentivizes China. I think it puts in danger a number of things. I wish China wouldn't react that way, but if it's going to, we have to be able to maintain our basic understandings. And that includes visits from government officials from the United States. We can't let China dictate whether we do or don't visit Taiwan.
I just jump in real quick. 2 points. One is the question taken from Representative Case is the degree to which the U.S. wants to allow China to veto its actions, right? So countries in the rest of the Indo-Pacific will be looking very closely at whether that happens. If China is able to establish some sort of a veto, I think that will create more doubts about U.S. credibility and commitment. The second point is that I think with Speaker Pelosi's visit, there's a view that it's this out of the blue. It's not. It's a trajectory. It's been building up. The Chinese military activity around and near Taiwan, crossing the cross-strait median line, having naval patrols around Taiwan, blocking off areas for exercises, including missile exercises. That's all been happening. It's just that once the visit happened, they shifted all of that to around Taiwan. If you look at the year before, I think there were almost 1,000 military flights that had been near Taiwan. So people have not been paying so much attention to what had been going on before. But essentially, what happened around Speaker Pelosi's visit is a new step, but it's not one that's come out of the blue. It's one that the PRC has been building up toward, and it's important to recognize that.
Thank you both. Dinda?
Hi, I'm Dinda Elliott, and I wanted to ask a couple of questions that bring this down slightly more to the ground level. One in particular for Bopa, I wanted to ask you about the different conditions that the U.S. and China require when they are making investments in Cambodia, and whether the Chinese behavior feeds into corruption. And just building on a conversation we had a couple of days ago, wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit. And then for Ian, the question is about is a more psychological and loyalty focused question having to do with Singaporean identity. Whether Singaporeans still feel comfortable identifying themselves as Chinese, or are they feeling that they really want to identify themselves as being Singaporean? Sorry, talking about the Chinese Singaporeans, not all Singaporeans. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, actually, I wanted to I want to point that out as well. As you see that the relationship between Cambodia and China becoming stronger and stronger. I actually did not finish my whole thing when I first started talking. So now China is one of the biggest Cambodian bilateral trade partner. From that to one of the biggest loan giver to Cambodia, and also it's provide one of the biggest one of the country that provide Cambodia a lot of power. Electricity that allows a lot of business to operate in Cambodia. But with this investment in infrastructure and constructions and many other investment, and with the BRI that allow other investors to come to Cambodia, with this, without a doubt that it has brought Cambodia a lot of benefit in terms of economy. So many Cambodian benefit from that. Cambodia is a benefit from that. But I want to emphasize that most of the company that from China that coming to Cambodia, they are mostly doing business connect to with tycoon, like a well-connected, powerful people in Cambodia. So most of the money mostly go to those guys, not directly to the poor people. And because of the loosely regulated law in Cambodia, the investment in that China brought in could also bring in a lot of criminal activity. For example, started in 2015 or 16, many Chinese company that come to Cambodia, that gambling company that hijacked the BRI, they brought in gambling and scams. So Cambodia coastal area became a slave compound, $1 billion slave compound for Chinese criminal and other corrupt officials that help them to operate. And it became like a breeding ground. And if you want to check, you can also Google slavery in Cambodia. You see how big and how grave it is. So with the benefit, and it comes with that. In regard to the investment with the US, the US also provided a lot. It helps boost Cambodia economy. But I think the way the US does business in Cambodia, it's very limited, and the US require Cambodia to pay more attention or to become closer to it, which is impossible because the way the US respond to, for example, the Chinese and Cambodian relationship, for example, last year it cut off its aid for the forest protections and also military academy for the students. These are the two examples. And the other thing is that when it comes to investing in Cambodia, the US itself wrote in its own climate statement saying that Cambodia is a very corrupt country, and not many US company interested in investing in Cambodia. And the other thing is that when it comes to investment in the US, the regulation is very, very complicated, and oftentimes the US decide to give. Through my observations, oftentimes the US decide to give opportunity to the countries, not even though it say that, you have to follow our condition, for example, avoid human violations or any forest exploitations. But in reality, it would give benefit to the country that it see us give the US more benefit. You see what I mean? Even though it say that, it say, all right, we're gonna cut off this aid because you guys violate like human rights or exploit the environment. But as the observers say that the US actually did not mean that, doesn't mean that. The fact that it react to Cambodia impulsively and cut off the aid for the forest protections, it was in response to Cambodia allowing or taking the funding from China in terms of renovating the naval base in the coastal area. So, you know, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bofa. And Ian, do you want to take the question around Singaporean identity?
Yeah, so I want to say that the PRC, for its part, has been trying to reach out and sort of get traction on this idea of having special affinity for the PRC because of race, largely reaching out to ethnic Han Chinese, right? You see this also in the 20th Party Congress work report. Now, and also some of the United Front stuff. This is a sort of old phenomenon where the Chinese states, not just the PRC, before the PRC, the ROC state and the Qing state as well, had tried to mobilize, use ethnic Chinese communities overseas. And when you look at what the PRC is doing today, it's not just Singapore, it's in many places where there are ethnic Chinese communities. Now, for a place like Singapore, which I have to state for those of you who don't know, we may be majority ethnic Chinese, about 70%, but we are a multi-ethnic country. Right. And so we are not defined as being Chinese ethnically or culturally, even though many of the people there are here are that way. Now, are of that sort of ethnic group. Now, for Singapore, the way that we've defined our identity since independence has been very negatory. I mean to say that it's been defining ourselves in terms of what we're not. We're not China. We're not Western, however defined. I don't like that term, but we're not Malaysia, we're not Indonesia. So what that also creates is a certain vacuum for many people, including ethnic Chinese in Singapore, who some of whom are looking for this sense of belonging, identity, authenticity, which when China comes with this claim about Chineseness and how the PRC state is representative of that, it's attractive to some of these people. And that pulls at Singapore society, as it does with many other ethnic Chinese society, other societies with ethnic Chinese groups. And so in Singapore's case, this creates a lot of pressure and tension. It helps drive some of this discriminatory behavior towards some of our minorities, which I don't particularly like. But this is something that the sort of effect, right, of PRC efforts to play on ethnicity has created. And it's not just Singapore. I just want to say that during the 60s, there's this similar effort. You see this sort of blow up in a very violent way in Indonesia, and the PRC state just basically withdrew. And that's something I think for ethnic Chinese communities we have to be aware of. And it's also important to recognize that the PRC and the CCP, they're political entities. One's a state, one's a political party. They claim to be synonymous with Chinese culture or Chinese ethnicity. They are not. Culture, ethnicity, this stuff has predated 1949 and 1921 if you look at the CCP. And so in that sense, sometimes in a lot of the discussion, there's a lot of conflation among ethnic Chinese communities as well. And that sort of creates pressure and friction locally that could potentially be quite divisive, right? I don't think ethno-nationalism worked very well for Germany or for Serbia. I don't think it's going to work very well for China either, right? If they're going to be playing this game in places where there are lots of ethnic Chinese who are not PRC citizens.
Thank you very much, Ian. We can go to the next question.
Hi, I'm Chi Xiang. I'm a MA student in the Regional Studies East Asia program. I'm Singaporean, by the way, and happy also to discuss this issue about like ethnic Chinese Singaporeans and our identity within this wider culture. But my question is with regards to this notion of non-alignment in the context of US-China rivalry. So given the seeming inevitability of continued US-China rivalry in the international system, there's been talk about a need to have a reinvigorated non-aligned movement so that middle powers and smaller states can act in ways to manage this conflict in a manner that is not so unstable that they cannot survive or thrive otherwise. So my question is, how viable do you, all the panelists, think such a construct might be? who the likely members would likely be, and what such arrangements could look like. Thank you.
Who would like to start?
I mean, I guess my immediate question is, I don't know the answer, but my question is, what has changed since the Cold War and the non-aligned movement of post-World War II? What is different, and does that construct work? That was, of course, a construct that was to that time, and in large part, many of the countries in the non-aligned movement weren't forced to the choice, but eventually, I think they gravitated one way or the other, at least in terms of kind of a post-Cold World War construct. I wonder whether the scope of international involvement by kind of the U.S. and its partners and allies and friends, and China and its equivalent is much broader than kind of a U.S.-Russia construct, so that it really does not have the same effect. You cannot find the same safety in the non-aligned movement as perhaps you could during the Cold War. Of course, if enough countries join that construct, then it becomes very effective. And I don't think that's a bad thing, by the way. I think that what's important here is that we have a world in some kind of an equilibrium where what I view as very unfortunate goals by China to exert domination and influence and to ignore the international rules-based order, especially in the Indo-Pacific, but not just in the Indo-Pacific, should not be accepted. If that equilibrium denies China that opportunity, and that equilibrium involves a non-aligned movement with critical mass to really be able to resist leverage, as I put it earlier, from China, or for that matter, from the other side, because I think that non-aligned movement, whatever it calls itself, by definition is going to be more defensive from a China perspective, and probably more inclined towards kind of, again, the international rules-based order of the last 3 generations. And so it's an interesting question. I'm not sure it would work exactly as you have laid it out, at least the goals, but it might not be. It certainly is. It's certainly in effect informally, but formalizing it may have some good advantages. That's a quick reaction.
So I'd say that the non-aligned movement worked rhetorically during the Cold War, but not particularly effectively. And I think that's going to be the case today as well, and probably even less effectively for 2 reasons. One, what I just laid out, the various countries, and as they engage the US and the PRC and others, have very diverse interests, right? So there's going to be a massive collective action problem. And for a non-aligned movement that is global to really have an effect, they have, and to perhaps be able to bargain collectively, they need to overcome that collective action problem. It's not apparent to me how that's going to happen. And so those internal rifts may very likely cause the whatever arrangement to fall apart this time around, just as it did the previous time. The second issue is externally, right? If there's a view that non-alignment is seen as inimical to the interests of one major power or the other, there's going to be a lot of pressure from the outside, whether this is in terms of trying to entice and pull various members aside, and we're starting to see this with ASEAN, or if it's the case of putting pressure and punishing particular governments. And of course, it's not just on governments, right? You can see potentially the support for various political parties, insurgent movements, etc. Domestically, this is a very tempting proposition, I think, for major powers to engage in. It's happened historically, and there's no reason why it won't happen again. So that kind of pressure may also cause the whatever effort at non-alignment to fall apart. So there's both the sort of internal difficulty as well as the external one.
Yeah,
I just,
think,
I'm sorry, I'm going to interject and leave you all. I've run out of my time. So I really appreciated the conversation here today. I look forward to kind of working with all of you. And again, thanks for my own education today. By the way, I just want to remark that on Cambodia, that's thought-provoking what you have said about Cambodia, because I don't know, I had not thought that there was a road back, and that's instructive that when these choices are made, And I think Cambodia was forced to a choice for whatever reason. We can argue about the reasons to go kind of in the direction of China. That quickly compounded itself and made it harder to find your way back. And so these are just observations on the comments on Cambodia. But I'm going to leave you now, and good luck with the rest of your conference. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us, and have a safe flight back home. Thank you. Ian, I wanted to actually just follow up on one piece that you said, and then we'll turn to our next question. So actually Mongolia came to mind.
I think Bopa had something to say just now, though.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I would like to add to the Nanyalan part. I don't think it worked because in the past, if my memory doesn't fool me, Cambodia, like the former king Norodom Sihanouk, he wanted to be like neutral, you know, and so the US was angry with us, and the US bombed the shit out of us along Vietnam border. So that's, you know, that's what happened when you want to be neutral.
There you go.
Just something that I learned, you know, like a small fact.
It's very sobering, but it's very sobering to think about what these consequences and what these choices of the terminology mean. Ian, before we turn to our next question, I just wanted to pick up on one piece that you talked about earlier about, can you talk a little bit more about ASEAN and the options that you're seeing in the ASEAN space as countries, as Asian countries consider what their options are? Because I think oftentimes we could fall into this trap that everything is just about the US and China, when in fact, you're seeing so many different types of options, both bilateral and multilateral, that are actually different modes and models of opportunity. Are there any thoughts here you want to share on what you're seeing on your perspectives vis-a-vis ASEAN?
Right. So for ASEAN, there's a lot of talk from the outside about ASEAN centrality. But I think within ASEAN, there's a lot more debate about where to go. So there's some of us in the region joke that, well, talking about ASEAN centrality, we're sort of looking like a donut or a bagel where the center might be hollow or empty, because for ASEAN members, getting together on to find common ground is becoming increasingly difficult. So what often you get is the lowest common denominator that might not really be very meaningful. So there's questions about how we move ahead, whether we do ASEAN reform, and whether if we decide to go that route, how it's going to be done, who's going to help pay for it. All that is unsettled. There's the question of, okay, maybe ASEAN can continue in the way that it has, ineffective and all that, with some other supplements, right? Maybe there can be other arrangements that can be made within certain members of ASEAN or with extra ASEAN partners, but that could also further erode ASEAN's role. And so that's something that sort of is up there and unsettled as well. So I suppose in an ideal world, Southeast Asian countries, would want ASEAN to work because that gives them a bigger platform. Collectively, they have more voice. But I think when it comes down to practice, ASEAN is proving quite unwieldy, and how to move forward is quite unclear at this point. I just add that makes ASEAN subject to more competition by the US and China. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, talking about ASEAN, I think it's somewhat ironic because I think Cambodia at some point, because of its close relationship with China recently, it has caused some Asian members angry, especially in regard to the issue of South China Sea. For example, I remember 10 years ago, I was covering ASEAN Summit when Cambodia chaired ASEAN. During that time, the Chinese government gave Cambodia $500 million in loan and grants. And that was the first time that in ASEAN history, after 45 years, that the member could not manage to issue a joint statement because of the wording around South China Sea. So there's that. And also, I think Ian must know also that there's some suggestions that Cambodia and other countries should be kicked out because we are too close with China. And I mean, Ian could add to that because the scholar, I think, from Singapore, and also the leader, Mr. Lee. Yeah, Mr. Lee also mentioned that in the document in WikiLeaks that journalists wrote a few years ago.
Right. So there's a lot of frustration with Cambodia and Laos in particular. That you're mentioning a retired diplomat, Bilahari Kausikan, and the WikiLeaks from our prime minister. Now, the question, though, is, I think kicking out Cambodia and ASEAN and Laos from ASEAN is, I think, an easy solution. I think ASEAN, it does pull apart in many different ways as well. So the question also is, how are ASEAN mechanisms going to be more effective? ASEAN works by consensus. It works by avoiding any sort of intervention or intervention-like issues pertaining to member states. So that makes regulation, that makes implementation of any agreements really, really difficult. So apart from sort of kicking out the current members or creating some subset of ASEAN, if there is interest in continuing to invest in ASEAN, there must be some thought put into how ASEAN works. It's very different from the EU. Just the Secretariat in terms of a coordination function is pretty weak. Do we sort of put more resources in there to make the Secretariat more effective at its current mandate? Do we sort of increase other things? These are also debates that simmer below the surface, but there's very little political will among the leadership of ASEAN member states to discuss. And that, I think, creates more potential for US-China contestation within ASEAN and puts a damper on ASEAN's ability to function to its full potential.
Thank you. Thank you both for those views on ASEAN. We have about 5 minutes left, so maybe we can do one or two last questions. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary. I work in the renewable energy sector. I have a question for Ian and Bipul. So we talked about the US and China impact from the trading and infrastructure development perspective. I was curious about from the soft skill perspective, how does people in Singapore and in Cambodia see US and China? Do they have a more positive view over US than China, or China over US? Or there's no noticeable difference, or people think both countries aggressive and arrogant? I'm just curious about that.
Yes, actually, so that's the question, right?
Yeah, that's a question.
Okay, I can talk from my own perspective as a journalist. Definitely, clearly that I might indirectly, or I don't see it, that I at some point benefit from China in terms of economy, in terms of the infrastructure that Chinese government have tapped Cambodia, without a doubt. I think that's, the road and bridges and everything else. But as a journalist, I really need a free space to talk and to express my feeling freely. And that is very important to me. And I don't think Chinese government could give you guys, Chinese people that, or even me. So actually, as Cambodia and China getting closer, our leader become more authoritarian. That means people like me having a hard time. That's why I'm coming here. So the only side that could provide me with this opportunity to, kind of using my skill and what I want to the fullest, which become one of the best reporters, and I hope in the future I will become one, is the US. The US government has helped me along the way to not only give me the education, for example, allow me to take part in the State Department program, Hubert H. Humphrey, providing me a year of studying to be whatever I want to improve my quality. And now this opportunity to study here for a year as a journalist to improve my skill and to be even a better journalist. So without a doubt that I love the US for that. But what I want more from the US is that come and work with the government and try to find a way to invest, I don't want Chinese government to just take control. To take so much, influence Cambodia so much that the Chinese, the US government could not kind of penetrate, like get its stance in Cambodia, because it would affect people like me and a lot of Cambodian people, especially now, expressing your idea or your opposite idea to the government online you could be in trouble in Cambodia. So this is the things that we me as a journalist do not like Chinese government so much when it comes to influence on Cambodia. But on the other side, I do not like the US so much when it comes to investing in Cambodia, because of course the US want us to be a democratic country, but I think the US should ask itself, does it do enough to influence Cambodia in that kind of side? Does it give Cambodian people enough opportunity or windows to study and to learn, to really understand what the freedom really mean? And I think it's very important to really kind of spread the educations that how important freedom is in this kind of country. I mean, other part of the country that controlled by authoritarian leader as well. So I don't have like a view on one country, but I have pro and con for each country, and I hope that's enough for you to understand. But if you want more, maybe I can explain to you afterward. But this is, as a Cambodian, I want to reiterate that freedom is very important. And unfortunately, over the past 6 years, when Trump got into power, the fake news spreading. So right now, I don't know where to go, because the US too suffer this kind of problem. In the past, when I came here, actually I came here in 2013 to get a Courage in Journalism award, because I was detained and got shot at through my job. And the US journalist said, oh, we're so lucky that we do not have the issue like you do in your country. But this time I came here, they all complained about all these issues that we are under pressure, and now our government become more and more authoritarian, and it has become harder and harder for them to report and to their job. So I don't know where to go for help now, because I feel like American journalists also having this problem. Yeah.
And Ian, just one moment before, I mean, just as a side note, for those of you that don't know Bopa's story, it's an incredible story of what she's gone through to do reporting and journalism from Cambodia, and including the winner of the 2013 International Women's Media Foundation Award. So please do check out her incredible story. And we're very lucky she's at Harvard for the year with us this year. Ian, would love to turn to you.
Yeah, so I think in Singapore, views are quite varied. I have to say that. Generally and historically, the US has been seen to be a regional stabilizer, and that tends to be quite welcome. However, there are also concerns that the US sometimes may be uncommitted. So the withdrawal from Afghanistan weighs very heavily, that the US sometimes can get into these adventures that it draws other actors in, such as the invasion of Iraq, right? So that also weighs pretty heavily, especially since we have a pretty sizable Muslim minority. So for them, that sort of Islamophobia that sometimes creeps up from the US is of a concern. Now, this sort of sense that the US might be potentially problematic is, of course, something that the PRC side tries to emphasize now in the messaging. And so this gets me to the looking at the PRC, where there is, what we see is there's a lot of effort to sort of work the media, work social media, work private chats to sort of shift opinion, sometimes with this sort of emphasis on the superiority, I suppose, of Chinese culture. That, of course, creates domestic tension, as I had mentioned, as sort of loyalties get pulled. The PRC also, but for some people, they see that pull of the PRC as being sort of a culture that they find attractive, that they find that the PRC's authoritarianism, as opposed to the US push for more transparency, more restraint, is something that they're more comfortable with. So there's that certainly that attraction. There's the view that China, the PRC offers economic opportunity, that it offers perhaps the way forward in the future. So those are very, very split views, I think, that you find in Singapore. There's a lot of contestation right now that I don't think will get resolved anytime soon. But I do want to add one more thing, which is when you look at some of those investment that the PRC is putting in the region, you have to also ask why previously there was less investment. Some of this has to do with the fact that they're fundamentally risky. So in terms of market forces, there's less attraction. And so when the PRC comes in and does some of these investments, it might be working with various regimes, parties that might be less favorable towards, say, good governance. And so that creates instability in the region as well. And it sort of feeds the rent-seeking behavior of some of these parties, right? So in a way, whether it's a debt trap diplomacy, I don't know. There's a view, but there's certainly a possibility of what the PRC is doing is very similar to the sort of unequal treaty stuff that other foreign powers were doing in Qing China and Republican China back in the day. So there is also that view that the PRC, through its money, can potentially be destabilizing.
Well, Ian, thank you very much for those views, and Bopa for your views. And I know the congressman had to leave, but I just wanted to say, as we wrap up this panel, some of the things that I'm taking away around this is not a zero-sum landscape of what choices countries are facing in terms of how they think through multiple options, whether that's on the infrastructure side, whether that's looking at social choices, environmental choices, obviously with climate change and the backdrop of COP27. And then as you think about some of the more democratic authoritarian choices also that countries are also trying to face as they think about the models that they want to put through, and who can you rely on at the end of the day to really be there for you and to model that way forward. I think it's more complex than ever in many ways. It's much more multifaceted than where we were coming out even 50, 60 years ago. Thank you very much. First, Ian, a huge thank you to you. It's 4 a.m. in Singapore. We are very grateful. You are still up and looking so alert. So thank you so much for really rich conversation. Bopa, thank you for everything that you have contributed today, but all your ongoing courageous journalism and work. And a huge thank you to the congressman, who we hope is on his plane safely, returning home. Edward, thank you very much. And the floor is back to you.